Some moments feel like they were waiting for you long before they actually happened, sitting quietly inside your chest and making your breath feel heavier than it should. My name is Brianna Hayes. I am 26 years old, and I learned very early that weekend dinners were never about comfort for me, especially when someone new was watching everything. At that weekend dinner, my sister introduced her new boyfriend with a smile that felt practiced and controlled, while I noticed how the attention in the room slowly moved toward me without anyone saying a word. The silence felt familiar, not because it was quiet, but because it was always pointed in my direction, as if I was an object they were waiting to examine. When he politely asked what I did for work, his tone sounded harmless, yet I felt my stomach tighten before I could answer. My father leaned forward just slightly, his voice calm enough to sound reasonable, yet sharp enough to cut through me. "Don't embarrass us. Just answer carefully, so nothing sounds strange in front of people who matter." My mother followed without missing a beat, her voice flat in the way it always was when she wanted to make something feel small. "This time, try to lie so you don't sound so pathetic like you usually do at family dinners." The air around me felt thicker, not because anyone moved, but because everyone was waiting for me to shrink the way I always had, before waiting for me to choose silence instead of truth. I kept my voice steady, refused to make myself smaller for their comfort. Slowly lifted my eyes and spoke the truth about this family. 15 minutes later, everything they thought they controlled quietly started to fall apart. If you think you know what happened next, stay here for the rest of the story, because the real truth was far more uncomfortable than anyone at that table was ready to face. Long before that dinner ever happened, I already knew where I stood inside that house. I learned it slowly through small pauses that lasted too long, through smiles that felt tight, through the way my presence quietly became something to manage rather than welcome. My name is rarely said out loud in moments that matter, and over time, I accepted that silence as a normal part of belonging. My father, Richard, was the first person who turned my work into a subject that needed to be handled carefully. He never shouted about it, never openly attacked it, but he always adjusted conversations when guests arrived, guiding topics away from me as if my life might embarrass the room. My mother, Linda, followed the same pattern in softer ways, changing her tone whenever my job became part of the discussion, lowering her voice, as though the walls themselves might judge. My sister Brielle never hid her opinions. She would smile politely in front of others, but her eyes always told the real story, especially in the quiet moments when only family could hear. She treated my work like something temporary, something unfinished, something that would eventually be replaced by something more acceptable. Over time, I stopped correcting her, not because I agreed, but because the effort felt heavier than the silence. Family dinners became lessons in observation instead of connection. People talked about careers, promotions, relationships, milestones, and vacations, while I learned to measure my words before they reached my mouth. Every time I tried to contribute, the air shifted enough to make me stop mid-sentence. It was not loud rejection, but it was precise enough to feel. I learned to laugh softly, nod carefully, and stay just interesting enough not to cause discomfort. I was always the first one to arrive at gatherings and the last one to leave, hoping that time and effort might earn something close to respect. Instead, I became the person who filled empty space while everyone waited for conversations that mattered more. I watched how their faces changed when someone brought up accomplishments that were not mine, and how quickly those same faces settled when I quietly stepped back. There was a moment I remember clearly, one that never involved shouting or tears, but stayed with me because of how quiet it was. Someone asked about my life, and for 1 second I thought they meant it. Before I could answer fully, the question floated away, replaced by laughter and stories that did not include me. That was the first time I understood that curiosity had conditions, and that my life only mattered when it could become entertainment. After that, control became a survival skill. I learned how to monitor every word, every reaction, and every small movement so that I would not disturb the balance of the room. I practiced shrinking myself in ways that felt invisible to others but painfully real to me, because peace in that house required me to take up as little emotional space as possible. Over time, I stopped expecting anything different. I stopped waiting for someone to ask how I was doing and mean it. I stopped hoping that my work would be seen as honest or respectable. Instead, I built a version of myself that could sit quietly, smile when required, and disappear when necessary, all so that the house could remain comfortable without my presence truly being felt. 2 days before that dinner, my chest already felt tight every time I thought about walking back into that house. I stayed in my room longer than necessary, not because I was late, but because I needed more time to decide which version of myself would be allowed to sit at that table. Every family dinner felt like an evaluation dressed up as a tradition, where my tone, my posture, and even my breathing needed to be balanced carefully to avoid becoming the problem nobody wanted to talk about directly. I stood in front of the mirror without searching for beauty, focusing instead on looking neutral enough to disappear if needed. I changed my clothes more than once, not out of vanity, but out of fear that something about me might invite questions I did not have the strength to answer honestly. A part of me kept calculating how to look normal in a way that never felt natural, as if normality was a language I had learned by listening instead of speaking. The news about Brielle bringing someone home did not feel like a surprise, but it created a quiet shift inside my chest that was harder to control. I could already feel the invisible comparisons lining up before they were spoken. I imagined the way glances would change, the way silence would last longer when my name came up, the way my presence would feel heavier, simply because someone new would be studying the room. That feeling sat in my stomach long before I reached for my jacket. For a brief moment, I considered staying behind. The thought appeared softly, almost kindly, suggesting a headache or a last-minute obligation that could save me from stepping into a room where I would have to perform calmness. I picked up my phone and stared at the screen, knowing there was no real reason to send a message, because the truth was simpler and more painful. I did not have the courage to choose myself over the expectation of showing up. As the minutes passed, the loneliness started before I even left the room. It did not feel dramatic or loud, but it wrapped around me in a steady quiet that felt heavier than noise. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to slow my breathing while my thoughts ran ahead of my body, already preparing for conversations that had not begun, already rehearsing answers I had not been asked. I touched the door handle and paused, not out of indecision, but out of recognition. I knew that once I opened that door, the version of me that existed alone would disappear, replaced by the careful version that smiled at the right moments, nodded at the right comments, and stayed silent when silence was required. That version of me was not fake, but it was tired, shaped by years of learning how to survive rooms that never felt fully safe. The hallway felt narrower than usual, as if the house itself had become aware of the weight I was carrying. Each step toward the living room made my thoughts quieter, not because I felt calm, but because I was already bracing myself for whatever version of normal I would have to become. I understood before reaching the table that this night would not be simple, even if nothing exploded, because the hardest moments were always quiet ones that nobody else seemed to notice. By the time my hand rested on the back of the chair, I had already promised myself that I would endure whatever came next, without drawing attention to the effort it would take. I was not brave enough to walk away, but I was quiet enough to stay, and sometimes that felt like the only strength I was allowed to have. The moment we sat down at that table, silence stopped feeling normal. There was nothing dramatic about the way Brielle introduced Trevor, which somehow made the tension feel heavier. Her voice stayed light, confident, controlled, in the way she always mastered when she wanted to appear perfect, and every person at the table adjusted their posture as if they were being measured by the presence of someone new. I felt the shift immediately, the invisible movement of attention tightening toward me long before anyone spoke my name. Trevor's eyes moved toward me in a natural, polite way that looked harmless to anyone who did not know this room. He smiled slightly, as if trying to make things comfortable, and asked what I did for work using a tone that felt respectful, almost careful, as though he wanted to show he was trying to understand the family he had stepped into. Before I could answer, Dad stepped in with his voice calm and smooth-sounding conversational, while carrying a weight that pressed down on me in a familiar way. Don't embarrass us, just keep your answers simple, and don't make this awkward for everyone at this table. The words sounded casual, but the warning underneath them felt sharp, as if I had already said something wrong before opening my mouth. Mom followed instantly, her tone steady and flat, carrying that quiet edge that had shaped most of my childhood, without ever raising her voice. This time, try to lie so you don't sound so pathetic in front of someone important for once. She did not look at me when she spoke. She did not need to. The message was never meant to be shared, only obeyed. A couple of short comments floated across the table, not shouted, not dramatic, just placed there to close the door before I could open it. We don't need details. Just say something normal and move on. Each word felt rehearsed, as if they had practiced these moments so many times that it no longer required effort. I lowered my eyes for a brief second, not because I felt ashamed, but because I felt the familiar pressure to shrink, to reduce myself to make them comfortable by becoming something easier to control. The silence around me was not empty. It was crowded with expectation, fear, embarrassment, all of it circling me while everyone waited for me to decide which version of myself I would serve them. My hand stayed still on my lap while my thoughts moved faster than my heartbeat. I understood exactly what they wanted to hear. I understood which version of my life would make them feel safe, respectable, untouched by anything they considered beneath them. I also understood in that quiet moment that I had reached the edge of something I could no longer keep doing to myself. I told myself I would not lie. I told myself I would not decorate my answers to make their faces relax. I told myself that whatever happened after this, I would not tear myself smaller, just to survive another dinner that was never meant to be safe for me in the first place. Inside my chest, the decision felt heavier than fear. I kept my face still while the room waited because I already knew that whatever I said next would change the way this table felt forever, even if no one admitted it out loud. When I spoke, I didn't raise my voice, and that somehow made everything heavier. I felt the pressure settle inside my chest, not like fear, but like a quiet decision that no one else could take away. My voice stayed steady because I was done shrinking myself just to make the room feel comfortable, and I refused to soften the truth for people who had never softened their treatment of me. I did not attack anyone. I did not shout. I did not cry. I simply spoke as someone who had carried too much for too long. I told them that the version of me they pretended not to see had always been stronger than the image they created. I explained how Brielle had used my life as material for her own stories, how she twisted ordinary moments into jokes, how she made herself look impressive by painting me as someone embarrassing. I said her words had not been harmless, because words repeated for years become part of how people learn to see someone in their own home. I let them hear that this was not accidental behavior, but a pattern that had been comfortable for her. I said that silence had not been neutral. I said that Mom and Dad did not just look away when it happened because they participated through distance, coldness, dismissal, and convenient distractions. I described the way I had been left alone during moments when protection should have been automatic, when support should have been instinctive, when kindness should have been present without being requested. I told them that neglect is not only loud, it can be quiet, slow, and constant. Then I turned toward Trevor without raising my tone or changing my posture. I told him I was not speaking out of jealousy, bitterness, or desperation. I told him he was not special because he had walked into a story that had already repeated itself. I watched his face carefully before I said the sentence that changed the air in the room. "You're the third guy this month she brought home." The room did not explode, but it collapsed inward. Dad looked away first, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the tension of someone trying to keep control while feeling it slip. His jaw tightened so hard the muscle jumped, and he could not find a single word to defend what had been allowed for years. Mom's fingers began to tremble against the edge of the table, and her lips pressed together so tightly that the color drained from them. She tried to sit straighter, tried to look composed, but the panic crept through her shoulders, visible in the way her breathing shifted. Brielle's face changed so fast that she forgot to hide it. The color dropped from her skin, her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if every sentence she had planned disappeared at once. Her eyes moved from Trevor to Mom to Dad, searching for a rescue that did not come. I did not feel powerful. I did not feel dramatic. I felt clear. For the first time in that house, I felt like I was not asking permission to exist. I said nothing else after that because nothing else was needed. About 15 minutes later, nothing in that house felt controlled anymore. Time inside that room lost its shape, stretching into something slow and uncomfortable that pressed against my chest without giving me space to breathe. I stayed seated, not speaking, not moving, watching the air grow heavier as every fork rested untouched and every glass remained full. Trevor shifted first his chair, scraping softly against the floor as his body leaned closer to Brielle with a tension that no longer looked polite. He did not raise his voice when he spoke to her, yet the firmness in his tone carried enough weight to change the rhythm of the room. He asked her to stand up with him, not as a request, not as a question, but as a clear signal that this moment no longer belonged to the family table. His hand touched her wrist in a way that was not gentle, but not cruel, either, just intentional. Brielle hesitated for a brief moment that felt much longer than it was, then stood up slowly, trying to shape her face back into the soft smile she had practiced for years. It did not work this time. Trevor moved toward the hallway without looking back, and she followed him with steps that felt less confident than she wanted them to appear. No one in the dining room spoke. Mom stayed frozen in her chair, her shoulders tight, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, as if it suddenly required all of her attention. Dad kept staring at the wall across from him, his hands folded together, his jaw locked in a quiet tension that betrayed far more than words could have. I could hear their voices from the other side of the hallway, not clearly enough to repeat every word, but clearly enough to feel the pressure of them. Trevor spoke low and fast, his sentences clipped in frustration. Brielle tried to defend herself with the same rhythm she had relied on before, but the steadiness in her voice had disappeared. Her words started to slip over one another, no longer clean, no longer polished, no longer controlled. I heard the sound of her breath changing, the slight crack that had never been there before. I heard Trevor stop responding for a few long seconds, allowing silence to do what anger could not. When they came back into view, everything about their posture had changed. Trevor did not look at the table. He did not look at Mom. He did not look at Dad. His face held a quiet expression, not rage, not sadness, but something colder, something more final. Brielle stopped a few steps behind him, as if she already understood that following closer would not change what was coming. He walked toward the front door without hesitation, his footsteps, even his shoulders straight, his focus steady. He opened the door, stepped outside, and closed it behind him without a single backward glance. No goodbye, no explanation, no apology offered to anyone. The sound of the door settling into its frame felt louder than any argument that could have filled that space. Brielle remained standing in the middle of the room, her hands loose at her sides, her breath shallow, her eyes shifting in small, unfocused movements, as if she were trying to understand where control had slipped away from her. I stayed silent, not because I was afraid, but because nothing else needed to be said. Sometimes the quiet carries more truth than any voice ever could. Later that night, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like pressure about to explode. I stayed seated longer than anyone else, not because I felt small again, but because I wanted to understand how quickly a room could shift from control to collapse. The air felt heavier without Trevor, as if the truth he pulled loose was still circling the ceiling, refusing to disappear. Dad was the first to move, not physically, but emotionally. His shoulders tightened, his jaw locked, and when he finally spoke, his voice no longer tried to sound calm. He told me I had embarrassed this family, that I had humiliated them in front of someone who never needed to know our business, and that my timing was selfish. He did not ask why I spoke. He only asked why I did it in front of a stranger, as though silence had been a duty I was born to protect. Mom shifted after him, no longer frozen, no longer quiet. Her eyes stayed on me while her hands trembled just slightly in her lap. She said I had crossed a line, said I should have stayed quiet for one more night, said I had ruined something that could have been handled privately. Her tone was not screaming, but it was sharp enough to cut, because this was the first time she chose disappointment over distance. For years she avoided me without emotion, but now she looked at me with blame that felt heavier than neglect. The sound of footsteps interrupted the tension, slow, unsteady, and irritated. Brielle returned to the dining room with eyes that no longer tried to look composed. She did not sit down. She stood behind her chair, gripping the back of it like she needed something to hold her upright. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but it was not sadness, it was anger that had nowhere else to land. She accused me of ruining her happiness, of tearing apart a moment that was supposed to belong to her, of dragging out truths that did not matter. She moved closer with every sentence, not touching me but trying to press her presence into my space. She said I had no right to speak, that I had always been too quiet to deserve attention, and that I only opened my mouth now because I wanted to hurt her. Her words were louder than before, but they sounded empty because they were no longer balanced by control. This was what she sounded like without power. I did not argue back. I did not defend myself loudly. I kept my posture still, my hands relaxed, my breathing steady. The calm I felt did not come from weakness. It came from distance I had already created inside myself. I looked at all of them without raising my voice and said that I was no longer interested in being managed, hidden, reshaped, or explained to protect their image. I told them that I was allowed to speak when something hurt me. I was allowed to tell the truth when I felt erased. I was allowed to stand in a room without being corrected into silence. I made it clear that I was not asking for permission anymore, and I was not apologizing for refusing to lie. The room went quiet again, but this time it was different. It was not controlled silence. It was not comfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when people realize they have lost authority over someone they thought would never move. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I knew this would be the last night I let my family decide how much pain I was supposed to tolerate to keep the peace. I did not threaten them. I did not announce anything dramatic. I simply understood that the door between us had closed, not with anger, but with clarity. I stayed seated not because I belonged there, but because I was no longer afraid of standing up. A few weeks later, silence in my life stopped feeling empty. It started feeling honest. I stopped checking my phone for messages that never came with warmth. Stopped preparing explanations I no longer owed to anyone. Stopped shrinking my thoughts just to keep a room comfortable for people who never tried to understand me. My days became quieter in a way that felt clean instead of lonely. I woke up without feeling watched, judged, or measured against someone else's version of success. That was when my close friend Hannah Blake returned into my routine in a way that felt natural rather than dramatic. She never asked me to explain everything from the past or justify my choices. Hannah never spoke to me with pity or curiosity that felt invasive. She simply treated my decisions as something normal and something worthy of respect. We spent time talking about plans instead of pain, about what felt safe instead of what had hurt, about boundaries instead of apologies. One afternoon, while sitting across from her with warm cups in our hands, I realized something that surprised me. The conversation never circled around bitterness or anger. It stayed grounded in acceptance and self-protection. I did not feel the need to defend myself, lower my voice, or soften my truth. That calm did more for me than any argument I could have ever won inside that old house. While my life moved forward, the consequences behind me unfolded quietly. Brielle began to lose the easy admiration she once relied on. People started stepping back from her without confrontation, not because of loud accusations, but because patterns became harder to ignore. Her stories stopped sounding charming, and her behavior stopped being excused. Situations that once worked in her favor started revealing cracks. She could no longer hide behind polished smiles. My parents felt their own shift in ways they could not control. Friends who once praised their perfect image grew distant. Conversations, shortened invitations became less frequent. Nothing dramatic happened, no public scene, no loud exposure. The distance grew naturally, slowly, without cruelty, the way truth often does when it is no longer forced to stay buried. Through all of that, I did not feel the urge to return or explain myself. I felt space where guilt once lived. I felt clarity where confusion had stayed too long. For the first time, I understood that distance was not something I owed an explanation for. Distance was something I earned by finally choosing peace over permission. I learned that self-respect does not arrive loudly. It settles quietly when you finally stop asking for approval from people who only valued you in pieces. Cutting ties is not an act of weakness. It is an act of survival that teaches your mind and heart to breathe again. Silence is not the same as surrender. It can be the strongest boundary you ever place between yourself and harm. If you stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you for giving your time and your attention to something that was deeply personal. I hope you felt seen rather than entertained, understood rather than judged. If any part of this reflected your own experience, you are welcome to share your thoughts in the comments, not for validation, but for connection.